Ethics in a Nutshell, Chapter 2. What's ethics? Government bodies have ethics panels, corporations and businesses have ethics boards. In most cases, in popular society, when a person speaks of ethics, they're talking about compliance with the law. That's what businesses typically want to do. That's what ethics panels typically do. They want to make sure that whatever body that they're representing is in compliance so the company or the government or whatever, or the person doesn't get into any legal trouble. When philosophers use the term ethics, they're talking about what we morally ought to do. And the approach of philosophers in trying to answer what we morally ought to do is distinct from the approach of a person associated with the government or an attorney or a person who's working on an ethics board for a corporation. What distinguishes the philosopher's approach is that we necessarily use and defer to logic and reason. We formulate arguments, we share reasons with one another, we try to see which positions are most logically defensible. And that's what determines which views win. If we were an attorney, we would look and see what is the legal precedent. If we were on an ethics board for a business, we want to look and see what does the law currently say. And that's how they would drive their actions or their behaviors, at least insofar as they're satisfying the ethics panel and such. Now, some businesses do have ethics committees that go above and beyond what's legally required, and that's very commendable, but I'm just distinguishing the way that philosophers in academic philosophy use the term and the way others use the term. Now, sometimes when folks are new to philosophy, and new to academic philosophy and philosophical ethics, they worry that this approach to answering what we morally ought to do through the use of logic is somehow hostile towards or incompatible with a religious understanding of what we morally ought to do. Well, I happen to think it's the case, and many people agree with me, that if you're a religious person and you think that a creator intentionally brought about the universe, brought about the earth, and either directly placed humans on it or intentionally brought them about through the process of evolution, it's probably the case that he, she, or it intentionally endowed us with these big brains and our ability to use reason and such. And it's also probably the case that if he, she, or it could foresee these big brains and could foresee the power of these big brains, they would expect us to use those brains not only to uncover truths about the natural world and to use that to better science and technology and our living conditions, but also he, she, or it would probably expect us to use those big brains to make better decisions about our actions. And so it's the case that philosophical ethics, even though it comes from a secular perspective and it doesn't defer to religious texts, it can definitely complement a religious understanding. And that seems to be something that, if you buy the argument that I just gave, is very consistent with being a religious person. I myself am a Christian, and my religious understanding informs my secular philosophical understanding, and vice versa. Now, people handle this in different ways. If you happen to be a very devoutly religious person and you don't think that approach would work for you, you think it's incompatible with your faith, that's completely fine. You can separate your work as a philosopher from your work or your decisions in your personal life. So you can just say, all right, for the purposes of playing this philosophical game, I'll examine these various arguments and such, but in my personal decisions, I'll still defer to my holy text, whatever it might be. That's okay. If that's the way you want to do that. But I don't think it's the case that you have to do that, but at the same time, I respect that if you'd like to do that. One benefit of the philosopher's approach to morality is that if you're able to think through ethical questions from that philosophical perspective, which doesn't necessarily rely on a religious perspective, you can engage in conversation with folks from a variety of backgrounds, endorsing a variety of what some philosophers call comprehensive doctrines. So if it were the case that I could only reason from the perspective of Christianity, well, I might pull out the Bible and I might turn to the Old Testament somewhere and look for a passage that speaks to the issue of the death penalty or on homosexuality or abortion. And this would be appealing, I would think, to both Jews because they respect the Old Testament. They call it the Torah. It also would appeal, I would think, at least somewhat to Christians, although we might definitely disagree over my interpretation of whatever passage I'm using. But I wouldn't be able to take a passage from the Bible and use that to convince or compel an agnostic or a Hindu or an atheist, other folks that I would like to engage with and other folks that I can expect to live in my community as being a member of a multicultural democracy. Folks that I respect not only as fellow citizens, but as fellow human beings. And so the benefit of the philosophical approach is that if I can make an argument about the death penalty, or if I can make an argument about abortion or homosexuality or any number of things, and I can think through those issues from that perspective, well, then I can have this serious conversation. I can respect folks who don't share my faith in that way. So there's lots of good reason to think that philosophical ethics is very much compatible with a religious perspective, and there's one reason that it's very beneficial, since we all live in a world that has persons from a variety of backgrounds and such. If you agree it's worthwhile to be able to engage folks from other backgrounds and be able to discuss serious political and moral issues with them, well, then the philosopher's approach is very beneficial in that way. If it's the case that you don't want to entwine your philosophical reasoning with your religious reasoning, that's completely fine as well. You can segregate the two and only do philosophical reason for the purposes of a class or for the purposes of fun or whatever. But I think that they're very complementary and also consistent with the reasonable expectations of a creator of beings with these big brains.